Okay. All right. Hello again. Welcome back to Our Lady study. We are looking at Hebrews chapter 5 this week. We were just about to get started, so I guess we'll just jump right in. So we are going to start with chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. And then we'll start reading in chapter 5, verses 1. So let's see. Would one of you like to read chapter 4, 14 through 16? And then the other can read 5, 1 through 4.
Okay, I can do 4.
Okay.
14. Seeing then that we have a great passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need.
Myra, can you get chapter 5, verses 1 through 4?
Yes, 1 second. Sorry, I'm on a new tab.
That's okay.
To find another version, I'm going to read version. Every Jewish high priest in the work of helping people with the things they must do for God. He must offer to God gifts and sacrifices for sins. The high priest has his own weaknesses, so he is able to be gentle with those who do wrong out of ignorance. He offers sacrifices for their sins, but he must also offer sacrifices for his own sin. To be a high priest is an honor, but no one chooses himself for this work. That person must be chosen by God, just as Aaron was. It is the same with Christ. He did not choose himself to have the honor of being high priest, but God chose him, and God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father."
Awesome. So
Did you want me to do it?
no, that's great. We'll stop there for now. So we're looking, we've talked a few times in a few different chapters about this concept of Christ being the high priest and having to be put into a position that allowed him to be that. And that required him to become a man, that required him to fulfill whatever the criteria was that God had for him. And we're going to look and see some of those things later on in the chapter. So at the end of chapter 4, the Hebrews author is telling us to remember that we have a high priest who is faithful and who is compassionate, and to allow the remembrance of that, the acknowledgement that we have that high priest who's understanding, to let us come boldly looking for grace and help when we need it. And then he goes on to talk about the duty of the high priest. The high priest was selected by men. He was chosen from the parameters that God set on who the high priest was supposed to be. And then he was given the task of representing man to God in order to make the sacrifices needed to cover the Israelites for the year. And here he points out that this man was compassionate because he also was a man, and he understood all of the shortcomings of being a man and all of the, not a man, a person, human. He understood the temptations that people have and the weaknesses that we have. And so it was important in establishing Christ and establishing Christ as the high priest, it was important for him to also understand those things. And that was part of why he had to come as a man to fulfill that portion of the qualifications for the high priest. And then this also points out that the high priest wouldn't have appointed themselves. So even under the Mosaic law, when they had their high priests, they wouldn't have just picked themselves and said, I'm the high priest and I'm going to do the thing. The Jews would have elected him through their process. And in the same way, Christ didn't just come in and say, I'm the high priest, guys. I'm going to do this for you. God selected him and put him in that position to do that. And so that's one of the ways that we know that this was the real deal. You know, a lot of times people look for glory for themselves when they do things, when they become public servants, when they become preachers, when they become any number of things. People can do that for the wrong reasons. And Christ, having not chosen it for himself, is a good indicator that he wasn't doing this for him. He wasn't doing this for his own glory. He was doing this as a servant to the people that he was serving. There was something else I was going to say.
I have a question.
Sure.
When the Levites were chosen to the line through which the priest would come, the high priest would come, is there ever a record of them breaking that? Or was I don't remember in the scriptures it ever saying that they broke that they tried to put somebody else as high priest that really wasn't. The only thing I remember them saying that the high priest, or the priests at least, should have done was to carry the Ark of the Covenant when David was moving it. I know that they let it come on a cart, but that's the only time I remember them doing something, and I just wondered if there was any place.
When the kingdoms were divided, didn't one of the two kingdoms appoint high or priests and high priests from tribes other than the Levites?
Yes, that there it is. That's it. That's where what I was looking for.
Gotcha. I don't remember that off the top of my head. We have another person. This might be my grandma. I don't remember that off the top of my head. It is very possible. It sounds right as far as when the kingdom split. There was definitely a lot of, they did a lot of crazy things trying to do what they thought was right. So that's possible. We can look at that. I'll jot it down to look at that next time.
No, it's fine. That's kind of what I was looking for. I just couldn't remember it, but that's where I'm looking at. And so they did get away from it.
Gotcha. Yeah.
From having, because the Levites probably would not have. Anyway, that's what I was looking for, was when the kingdom separated. That's where it was.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I'll look into it myself. It was just a question.
Let's see. This is kind of bothering me. I had another thought about the priesthood, but if it was important, it'll come back to me. Okay, so.
Well, he did offer a better sacrifice than the Levite high priests were able to.
Yes, that's kind of what I was going to say. So, keeping this in the context, this letter is written to Hebrews who were being exposed to false teaching, false understandings about what the gospel was. Part of this apostasy that they were falling into was going back to elements of Judaism because they thought this was needed. A lot of it had to do with the coming of the Savior, the Christ. There was this thought that, like, well, maybe he wasn't the real one, maybe there's a different one who's to come. And so people were kind of trying to blend things. And so this reminder that Christ, his sacrifice, his high priesthood is better than the one that they knew is another one of those reminders, like, hey, you know, there's a reason you came here. There's a reason that you chose this. Stay the course, because if you get sidetracked, you're gonna lose it. Thank you, Paulo. I was like, I know there's something else here, and I just can't remember what it was. Okay, so that was, we're in chapter 5, Julie. Also, just so you know, we are recording, so just so you know. But yeah, we're in chapter 5. We just finished with verse 5, pretty much. I'm gonna read verses 5 through 11, and we'll talk about those. So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As also he says in another place, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek," who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, all of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. That was too big of a chunk. I'm sorry. So let's just look at verses 5 through. Let's look at verses 5 through 8. So again, we're noticing that God appointed Christ as the high priest. He didn't take that on himself. He didn't choose that for himself. God appointed him. And then it mentions this Melchizedek. Do we all know who Melchizedek is? It's okay if we don't, I'm just asking.
King of Salem, priest, high priest.
Yep, he was a priest,
And
and
had no father, had no beginning. Had nothing.
right. So what's and I think we'll get into this more in a later chapter, but what is noted about, so we were talking just a minute ago about the high priesthood and how it was through the Levites, and there was a very specific order of how that passed on. And Christ was not a Levite, he was a Benjaminite. That sounds wrong. Is that right? Pretty sure he's a Benjaminite.
Yeah, that's right, I think.
Or was he of the tribe of Judah?
That's right, Judah. I don't know where I got Benjamin. My brain, sorry. Anyways, but either way, he's not a Levite, so he wouldn't have been able to be a high priest according to the succession that was set up in Mosaic law. And Melchizedek was before Abraham, or before Aaron even existed. And so the order of Melchizedek, being that Melchizedek was not a Levite, Christ could still be a high priest under the pattern of Melchizedek, but he couldn't under the pattern of the Levites. Does that make sense? Also, Melchizedek was not only a priest, but he was a king. And Christ is not just our high priest, but he is also the king, the originator of salvation. And so that's another comparison that we can make between the two. Any other thoughts on him? Okay. All right. So, verse 8 highlights that Christ, though he was a son, he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, which is another indication of his humanity, and that he was perfect. And as God, he knew everything. But when he came to earth, there were still things that he had to learn. And that was part of the process of him becoming qualified to be the high priest. And part of that being human, he had to learn things, he had to fulfill these qualifications. And one of those was learning obedience. Think about really any royalty. If you grow up as a prince, and then for some reason or another, you end up having to make your way in the quote unquote real world, doing everyday things, you would kind of have to relearn how to do things. And that's kind of the concept here. Like Christ had to relearn what obedience looks like when he's not connected to God in the same way that he's used to. So verses 9 and following, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about this. So the concept of, let's just read it. We'll read 9 and 10. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say. Well, I'll hold off on 11. So what does it mean that he was perfected?
It's funny. I just heard a study on this the other night when I had it on, and the person who was giving the study said that the word perfected in Greek or Hebrew or one of those other languages was telos, which means complete. Is that right? Is that the word?
That's great.
And so it was that it wasn't that he wasn't perfect, but it was that his work, he was completing his work to what he was being prepared for.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually pulled up a few verses that I wanted us to look at to show us the way to really understand the words in other languages, like in Greek and Hebrew, is to look at them in various contexts and then see like how they're used. And so I looked up the word telos and I found a few different verses to kind of give us an idea of like, what does it mean? What does that perfected or complete? What does that mean? So I'll just go through and give us each a verse. Does that work? Paula,
That works.
can you look up Luke chapter 2, verse 43? Myra, if you can do John 17, verse 4. Grandma, if you'll do John 17, well, I'll just give that one to Myra. If you'll do Second Corinthians 12, verse 9.
I get 2 Corinthians 12:9. Is that what you said?
Yep.
12:9. Okay.
And then
Good, it's close. I can find it fast.
And Paula, whenever you get there, you can go ahead and read it.
Okay.
Should I switch to my other version? You think it'll be all right in this? Okay.
Yeah, whatever you want, whatever one you want is fine.
Okay, sorry. All of my pages are stuck together. I should have stuck with my old one. Luke 2:43 When they had finished the days as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother did not know it, but oh,
That's good. So that beginning of the verse there, when they had finished the days, that's the same word. So it's a sense of completion. It's been finished. They did what they came to do.
okay.
Myra, do you have John?
17:4. I finished the work you gave me to do. I brought you glory on earth.
So again,
Still that easy to read.
yeah. So there was something to do. They did it. It's done. Finished. That's the word. And then I'm going to read 17 verse 23 says, I and them and you and me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them as you have loved me. So there the word is perfect, but it's the same concept. It's being made complete, made whole, being accomplished or fulfilled. And then Grandma, yours, 2 Corinthians.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
What was that? What was the verse that you read, Catherine? I'm sorry.
17,
21. Oh, 20.
20.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, 2 Corinthians 12:9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness.
Perfected. So again, that one might seem maybe a little more of a stretch from our English concept, but the whole idea again is there was a purpose, it was fulfilled, it's been completed, and that's what it was. So Christ coming to be made perfect really means he came, there was a purpose for him to come, he fulfilled the purpose, it was completed, and then he was able to do what he came to do. Does that make sense? So
He also did that completion through obedience.
right, yeah, and that's what this verse is talking about, is that part of his completing it was learning to obey as a son obeys.
Okay.
Right, definitely. All right, so then let's look at verses 11 through the end. Oh, does someone want to read that? I think. Okay, go ahead.
Myra. We have many things to tell you about this, but it's hard to explain because you've stopped trying to understand. You have had enough time that by now you should be teachers, but you need someone to teach you again the teachings that is like milk. You are not ready for solid food. Anyone who lives on milk is still a baby and is not able to understand much about living right. But solid food is for people who have grown up. For their experiences, they have learned to see the difference between good and evil.
Awesome. So we're gonna jump around a little bit here. In verse 14 here, the author compares spiritual maturity to being able to use reason to exercise discernment of good and evil. And so sometimes I think we think of spiritual maturity as like, all of the really deep theological theories, and all of the details, and all of the scripture, and you have everything memorized. And what this verse here is tying that maturity to is being able to use it. It's not just knowing the ABCs, but it's knowing how does that actually apply in real life. And I think sometimes that's what happens when we see people who, maybe they've been a Christian longer than we have, or they've had different experiences that would seem to us like they should know more, but they seem maybe not as mature as we would expect. And I think it's because of that. They might know the chapter and verse, they might know all the ideas, but if they don't know how to actually, in front of you in a situation, use discernment because they haven't been practicing that, that's a part of the spiritual immaturity. Our faith doesn't do any good if we just know the facts, if we just know the details. It does good when we're actually using it and applying it. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that verse. And the preceding verses are really leading up to that. Like, this is actually how you become mature, because he's talking about, just before it, he's talking about the comparison of milk to meat and how some of them should be teaching, and instead they're still relying on the basics because they don't know, they don't feel confident, whatever the reason is. And he's saying at some point you move past the milk. And when we think about it, like, I don't know how much we've actually stopped to think about the comparison, but babies need the milk because it's so easy to digest. Their bodies need all of the energy to be growing and changing. So they need that energy readily accessible, but they also need it frequently because it's readily accessible, right? And so they have to eat every few hours. And if they don't, then they get cranky because they're starving, because they need all that energy. And then as they get older, they can eat more complex food, and that food lasts them longer. Like, they can go between meals longer as they're eating more substantial food. And the same way with our faith, if we're still, when we're growing, when we're in a season of growth, we need to really be digging in deep, and we need all the nutrients, and we need all the really easy stuff. But as we get more mature, we shouldn't need to go back. We shouldn't be drinking milk every 2 hours. We should be having a meal, and then, in 4 or 5 hours, we can have another meal. Does that make sense? And so this maturity thing it builds on itself when you're not needing this like crutch of the milk so frequently. You can actually go and apply it in situations, and then your faith grows and you're able to be more mature. And then, you'll probably come up against something that you don't know, and then you can come back, you get your nourishment, right? You learn what you need to learn, and then you can keep applying. But if you're only ever stuck in like, you don't know, or you don't know how to apply something, you're like the baby who needs to eat milk every 2 hours, and you can't do anything with your life if you need to eat every 2 hours. It's not helpful to you, and you're not maturing. Does that make sense? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
That's definitely not.
Now this one, the version I have, that in verse 11, it says you have need because you've stopped trying to understand. Somebody else read verse 11, and it sounds like, if we're not attempting growth, if we're just constantly staying on the milk all the time, we're not going to grow.
Right.
Yeah, mine says you become too late to understand.
Yeah.
New
So-
King
So
James.
it's basically saying that, we've not, we're not giving the effort. We're not even trying.
Paula, you have New King James?
New says full of hearing.
Yeah, dull of hearing. So that might seem different, I guess, compared to Myra's version or even Julie's version, but they're the same really concept. Is dull of hearing and really thinking about it in the context of what was talked about before about the Israelites in the wilderness, and they chose not to hear. And so because they chose not to hear, they were kept out. So here, the choice is, are you leaning on the, what am I trying to say? If you're only leaning on the basics, then you're not listening to the weightier matters of the law, right? The measuring of the dill versus loving your neighbor. So it's really the same concept, even though the translations are a little bit different. As far as if you're dull of hearing, it's because
The
you're.
scripture also,
Excuse me. Go ahead.
yeah, it also tells us that that faith comes by hearing.
Right.
And what Paula was, what the scripture, the translation she had said that they were dull of hearing. So their faith wasn't going to be growing if faith comes by hearing, and hearing is the word of God. So they weren't applying.
Right.
Their hearing was dull. They weren't hearing. So it makes perfect sense to me.
Same
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
if you're tired of hearing, your faith can't be growing. If your faith will grow hearing the word, and you're tired of hearing, or you're too lazy to hear it, or
Right. And really looking at verses 12 and 13 in this, really 13, for everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness. That's not what I was trying to say. At the end of verse 12, he says, you have come to need milk and not solid food. So he's saying two things here, really. He's saying you ought to be past this point, right? You should be spiritually mature, and you're not. But he doesn't, his answer to that is not, here, have the meat. His answer is, there is meat that you need to be able to get to, and you're not getting there. And what they're dealing with is all of these other ideas they're trying to add into Christianity. And his letter is trying to remind them there are basics. You're straying from them. Let's look back at the basics. But in that, there's also this warning that we can't just stick with the basics. It's this section is saying both things. Both, we have to be mature enough to apply it, but we have to know what we're applying. And if we're not listening, if we're dull of hearing, if we're failing at that, we are not maturing, and we're leading ourselves down this path of falling away, which is the big warning of the book. Is there are very present temptations to leave what you know. Don't do that. You know what you know. There was a reason that you
make this choice.
Right. Don't leave it. Don't fall into the temptation. Don't get caught up in all of these ideas that sound great and that sound familiar, and they sound like what you're used to and what you thought it was going to be. Don't get caught up in that, because that's not the point. There was a reason. Stick with it. So
Yeah, and he was saying, it goes down with what he's saying further. It's that they think they're ready to move on, but they're not established enough in the foundation that they can't distinguish what's between good and evil. When you get to the point that you're into the meatier matters, then you've developed or been trained, as it says, to distinguish between false doctrine and
Right.
true doctrine. So, and now, but he's saying now you're not there yet. You're not being able to distinguish what it is. And that's why they're falling into these stray ideas.
Yeah, definitely. And even in the example of the food with a child, if you could get a child, like a little tiny baby who can't eat food, if you were able to get them to swallow meat, their body wouldn't digest it properly because it's not ready for it. So it would be the same concept. If you're trying to take on the weightier matters, but you're not ready, then you're going to mess it up. You're not going to apply the principles the way they ought to be because you're just not ready. And so, yeah, there's definitely both sides of that. Is there is maturity that you can get to. You may not be there yet though. And you have to consider both sides of that.
Yeah.
That's the end of the chapter. Were there any other thoughts or questions on the chapter? I know the very first study we did, we talked a little bit about the purpose of the book, and all four of us were here for that, but we didn't record that chapter on YouTube. And so I'll just kind of throw this out here now. The book was written as a encouragement to Christians who were struggling and falling away for various reasons. A lot of them, these particular Christians were Jewish Christians, and so they had grown up in Judaism and then they converted. And there was a bunch of teachings that were coming into the church that were really backed up by faulty Judaizing of Christianity. For example, the idea that Jesus wasn't the Christ and there was still another Christ to come. That's something that they had been taught and were dealing with their whole lives. And then they come to Christianity and they're like, oh yeah, there's the Christ. And then it would be really comfortable to fall back on, oh, well, maybe it's not him. Maybe there's another one still to come. And so as we're studying it, it's good to really think about how does it apply to a Christian today who is struggling in their faith? And for me, it's helpful to know that other people struggle with their faith, to know that a lot of what he tells them to do in this book is remember what you were taught. You were taught something, and there was a reason that you made the choice you did. There's a reason that you felt led to, or the reason you came to know Christ. So don't be persuaded away. It's also helpful to know that maturity takes application. It's also helpful to know that the promise that we have of salvation is better here than anywhere you could look for it. You can't get it anywhere else. Of course, it's better. But it's just, for me, this is always the book that I come to when I feel like I need a little kick in the tail. It's all about, you have to have community, you have to be studying, you have to be reminding yourself of what you know. And those are all things that I think no matter what your reason for struggling is, I think they can be helpful to just remind yourself. I need people. I need the examples of the faithful in the scriptures. I need to remember the not faithful and what happened to them. I need to remember that this is the best. I need to remember all of those things. So, yeah.
Yeah, no matter how difficult a time we're having in today, when you compare it to what they were also going through or what they were going through to hold on to this faith, you think, well, what am I complaining about?
Yeah, definitely.
It doesn't lessen what you're feeling any, but it's sort of like this, misery loves company.
Definitely puts it into perspective, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Next week will be, or next 2 weeks from now, that's
Okay.
the first Sunday of February, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
February the 7th, we'll be meeting again and we'll talk about chapter 6 then.
I have an appointment with my tax lady. She doesn't work on Saturday. She only works on Sunday. So I won't make that one. I'll have to get notes from you or go on YouTube since that's what you're doing it. So,
Okay, that works.
okay.
Study at 2. Okay, sounds good. Thank you guys for coming, and I hope that
Thank you.
chapter was helpful.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Julie.
See you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have
Bye.
a blessed week.